Oliver received a call that his wife, Emma, had been taken to the hospital by their neighbor. The neighbor was also the one who called the ambulance after sensing something unusual was happening at their home. Usually, the neighbor saw Emma at least twice a day when she walked the dog, but that day she hadn't seen her at all, which made her worried. Even though nothing seemed wrong, she decided to ring the doorbell. When she did, the dog barked loudly and jumped at the door, but Emma didn't answer. Emma was lying on the kitchen floor, not moving or responding to the neighbor knocking on the window. The neighbor quickly called an ambulance, and it arrived within minutes. They knew it was an emergency. They broke the door open and rushed Emma into the ambulance. While this was happening, the neighbor called Oliver. The ambulance team told her Emma was still alive and mentioned she had been given a yellow wristband. Oliver was so panicked that he didn't even hear the neighbor talk about the wristband during the call. Oliver was on his way to pick up the kids from school and take them home, but now he knew they couldn't go back. He didn't want to tell them something was wrong with Emma, so he stayed calm. After picking them up, he took them to his parents' house. He told the kids he had some adult things to handle and that they'd spend the rest of the day and evening with their grandparents. Oliver also called the hospital, but they only told him Emma had arrived. The receptionist said doctors were taking care of her, but that was all the information they could share. Oliver knew the hospital well and hoped that this would help him skip some of the usual paperwork families had to deal with. The hospital followed strict rules, which meant signing many forms to see someone in critical condition. Oliver really wanted to avoid that, but knowing the hospital well didn't make things easier. When Oliver arrived and said he wanted to see Emma, the staff acted hesitant. The woman helping him rushed to grab forms, but Oliver quickly told her who he was. She gave him a weird look and said she needed to make a call. After a minute, she returned with a smile and led Oliver to a room, asking him to wait for a while. Oliver felt relieved, thinking his reputation might be helping him. At least that's what he believed. He wasn't sure if he heard it correctly, but he thought the woman mentioned something about a yellow wristband. It would be strange if the neighbor had seen it, right? Usually, patients in Emma's condition got a red wristband. He had only seen the yellow one a few times, and it was for very specific cases. Oliver was certain Emma didn't fit into that category. The whole situation felt off, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Now that Oliver had realized this, he was even more eager to see his wife. He had already waited for nearly 10 minutes, but no one had come to check on him. His patience was wearing thin, so he quickly stepped out of the room to find a doctor. But right outside his door, someone was already waiting for him. 2 security guards stood there, blocking his way. Oliver felt anger rising inside him, but arguing wouldn't help. They had clear orders not to let him leave the room unless he was leaving the hospital for good. Oliver grabbed the phone and called the front desk, demanding to know what was going on, but the only response he got was that he needed to wait for a doctor. They also mentioned that they were worried he might lose control if left alone, which is why the security guards were stationed outside his door. That explanation only made him more frustrated. Did they really think he would cause trouble if left unsupervised, or was there something else going on? Was the staff purposely keeping him from seeing his wife? A thought crept into his mind. Maybe they didn't want him to notice the yellow wristband on her wrist. And if that was the case, they must have realized he knew exactly what it meant. No matter what their reasons were, Oliver knew one thing. He wasn't just going to sit here and wait. He had no way of knowing how his wife was doing, and the longer he stayed stuck in this room, the greater the chance that he'd be too late. Desperation set in as he searched for a way out. The door was out of the question with those tough security guards standing outside, and it was the only exit in the room. The window wasn't much better. It was risky since he was on the 2nd floor. But then an idea struck him. The window gave a clear view of the hospital entrance, and it could open slightly. Maybe he could get someone's attention from up here. The question was, would there be anyone outside who could actually help him? The chances seemed slim, but there was one way to make sure help arrived. He needed to bring the police to him. Oliver quickly called the police and convinced them to send a squad car. He explained the situation honestly, and the officer sounded shocked by the hospital's behavior. They told Oliver he should have just signed the forms like any other visitor, but his refusal didn't justify how he was being treated. The police car arrived 10 minutes later. Oliver waited quietly by the window, still hearing nothing from the security guards or about Emma. The worry was overwhelming him, so when the officer stepped out of the car, he acted immediately. He started shouting out of the window as hard as he could that they needed to help him. Everybody who was around to hear it looked up in surprise, and within seconds, the security guards had stormed in, most likely to shut him up. But then Oliver told them about the police. Suddenly, they had no power anymore. The police had seen and heard Oliver, and they were going to have to answer them. But it was not like they knew anything about the situation, as the security guards were just sent here to make sure Oliver did not leave. One of the guards quickly made a phone call, most likely to the person who had given them their orders. After a brief exchange, the guards turned to Oliver and, without a word, began leading him toward the entrance. The police officers had already made their way inside and demanded to speak with him. There was no other option but to comply. As Oliver walked through the hospital halls with guards at his sides, he could feel the stares of staff and patients alike. Whispers followed him, curiosity filling the air. None of them even knew yet that 2 police officers were waiting for him downstairs. The entire situation was spiraling into something he never could have imagined, and yet, through all of this, he still had no idea how his wife was doing. The officers were talking to someone Oliver recognized right away. It was one of the hospital directors and a head doctor he often worked with when sending patients there. The man looked furious, as if he could explode any second. One officer asked Oliver to explain what had happened. At first, Oliver hesitated because he just wanted to see Emma immediately, but the officers insisted he share his side of the story. Oliver complied, giving his account of the situation. The officers seemed satisfied that his story matched up with what they had already heard, making their job much easier. Without wasting any time, he ordered that Oliver be taken to his wife. A nurse quickly stepped forward to assist, and the officer himself walked alongside them, taking the opportunity to explain what he knew about this strange situation. As it turned out, Oliver had been under the impression that the hospital staff respected him far more than they actually did. In reality, they didn't like him at all. In fact, some might even say they hated him. To them, he was nothing more than a useless middleman, someone who made their jobs harder and cut into their profits. If he weren't around, they believed patients would come straight to them instead of going through him first. Oliver completely disagreed with that view, but right now, it didn't matter. What did matter was that this was the reason the hospital wasn't willing to bend the rules for him. In fact, instead of helping him, they wanted to make things even harder just to prove a point. Apparently, their actions had nothing to do with his knowledge about the hospital's wristband system. The officers had even questioned the directors about it, but they simply raised an eyebrow. They had no clue what wristband Emma was wearing, nor did they see why it was relevant. Oliver knew he had a lot to sort out with the hospital, but all of that could wait. His wife's health was the only thing that mattered now. The nurse led them to the room where Emma was supposed to be resting. As soon as Oliver opened the door, tears welled up in his eyes. There she was, Emma, peacefully sleeping in bed. She didn't look particularly elegant, but that was just who she was. And then his eyes landed on her wrist. That same yellow wristband was still there. Turning to the nurse, Oliver insisted there had to be a mistake. That band shouldn't be on her wrist, and they needed to double-check. The nurse had no issue looking Emma up in the system, and sure enough, a major mistake had been made. The yellow wristband was meant for new patients without insurance. What made this error especially dangerous was that uninsured patients weren't given immediate treatment if they had life-threatening conditions. In the wrong circumstances, this kind of mistake could have been disastrous. Fortunately, despite the mix-up, the nurses had still checked Emma's vitals and found nothing seriously wrong. She had simply passed out, most likely from dehydration. She often forgot to drink enough water, and on a hot day like this, it caught up to her. They had placed her on IV fluids, and she was slowly rehydrating. It wasn't long before she woke up, feeling much better and ready to go home. Oliver felt a massive wave of relief wash over him. The whole ordeal even softened his anger toward the hospital. In the end, he and the staff had an honest conversation about their working relationship and how to improve it. After some discussion, they found common ground and came to an agreement that satisfied both sides. And as for Emma, she made a full recovery without any trouble at all.